Sensors. Hello, welcome to our presentation. I'm happy to be part of this presentation, and thank you for being interested in the topic.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are connecting with us in this moment. I know some of you probably are in the East Coast, Central, or Pacific Coast. We're from California, and you're gonna see us probably sometimes drinking because of the summertime. But I'm glad that all of you take the time to have this conversation today. As you can see, there's the goals, a specific goal that we have, and we would like to make sure that we understand specifically more about the indigenous population from Mexico who come to the United States. And that's the main purpose of how to work with indigenous people from Mexico in this webinar. Next, please. Now, in a previous presentation that we have about the indigenous population from Guatemala, we discussed about the Latino, Hispanic terms. Then I'm not going to go through that in this webinar. But one of the things that we want you to have in mind when you're working with indigenous population, especially from Mexico, is that here in the United States, we have millions of people living in the United States for a long time. And according to the statistics that we have, 60.6 millions considering themselves Hispanics, Latinos, Latinas, are considered by the government in that kind of classification. Within those, 62% of those are considered Mexican. And of course, there's I want to discuss more about indigenous communities and why this is only mentioned Mexicans. But about 50% of those who born in Mexico and come to the United States and have been living here longer, 50% have been living for more than 20 years, and 31% of them are already U.S. citizens. And that will increase probably in new researches, because we know citizenship has been continue going every year and continue even though of the COVID pandemic. Next. Now, to make sure we understand what we're talking about, as probably some of you know, Mexico is in the southern border with the United States, and Mexico has 31 states. The name of Mexico is United States of Mexico, like the United States of America, but we call it short as a Mexico. According with the National Institute of Statistics and Geography and Informatics, INEGI, by 2015, Mexican population was 119 million, almost 20 millions. And recently I was checking again INEGI, and by 2020, they said there's more than 132 millions people in the whole Mexico. That's without counting the millions of people who lives here in the United States already. 83.9% consider themselves Catholics. That's the majority of the population who have been growing through the Catholic faith. And 8% consider other than Catholic. That include Protestants or other religions, you know, Buddhist, Islamic. And also 2.5% consider they don't have any religion in the whole population. About 25.7 millions are identify themselves as an indigenous person, and 6.6% of that population speak fluently any indigenous languages that exist in Mexico. Next. Now, these two represent some information. The one that you see at your left is in Spanish and represent the states and the different indigenous nations in those states. At this moment, we know that 5 states in Mexico has, not that they don't have any indigenous communities, but it's so small, the population, that they are not considered relevant in the sense of measuring population like the other states around Mexico. Now, the other one on your right is, as you see in the colors, southern part of Mexico is the most populated in the sense of indigenous languages speaking other than Spanish. Then it's important to remember that in Mexico there's hundreds of indigenous languages speaking, and a lot of the time they don't speak Spanish in a daily basis. Next one. Now, when we talk about indigenous people from Mexico in the United States, we need to remember that what it is important is a lot of indigenous people who come into the United States comes to work in the agricultural sector. And that's what we call it farm workers. However, it's not the unique way they work. You know, I know indigenous Mixtecs and Zapotecs who are professionals, MSWs, professors at UCLA, like one of my friends who's Mixtec, and he's a director of the labor center. Then indigenous people are not only agricultural workers, but the majority that we're going to find, at least in California, great majority of indigenous Mexicans work in the agricultural sector. Other thing is the population is increasing, not only in California, but because we live in California, we want to focus on California, even though we know that there have been a recent increase in New York and Florida, in all the US-Mexico border cities, major ones, you're going to find an increase of indigenous Mexicans living and working in those cities. Also, we know that they are going up north, North Carolina, Tennessee, and a lot of other states. You will have the opportunity to probably work with indigenous Mexicans in around your programs. Next, please. Now, coming back to to Mexico, you see the map is presenting, as I presented before, the most of the southern part of Mexico, which is Chiapas, Peninsula of Yucatan, Guerrero, are where more concentration of indigenous communities you will find. Then the indigenous farm workers did a study here in California, and has been for several years. They have been doing this study, and they find out that most of farm workers, and especially indigenous farm workers, are undercounted by official census takers because of the confusion on the sense of they said they're coming from Oaxaca or from Chiapas. Automatically, an official census taker is always a Mexican, you know. But usually, because they're working on the field, it's hard for the census takers to register everyone. Also, another thing is language barriers and unique cultural traits. It's an important thing that we need to consider when we are trying to provide inappropriate programs to this population we want to work with. Next, please. Now, in Mexico, we understand and we know that approximately 350 pre-European invasion languages are still spoken in Mexico today. What I mean is, before the invasion of the Europeans in 1500s, there were hundreds and hundreds of languages. Then, even though after more than 500 years of this process, we still have a great number of indigenous languages that coming from that period. There's a rich cultural and linguistic heritage in all of these communities. And when they come to California or any state in the United States, they bring all that richness to here too. Now we know that even though you can see in the map on your left different routes, the major native languages based on the percentages of people speaking it, we have Nahuatl, um, different Maya languages, Mixteco, Zapoteco, Tzotzil, Setzal. Those are also Maya languages. As you can see in the, I don't know, you can see the little square that you see by the map. Tzotzil and Setzal are Maya languages, but they are considered separate because in Chiapas, as you can see, the darker blue are the biggest population in the languages speaking there. Otomese and other native languages are common too, and we still have to register more. But at this moment, I think at this point, you understand what are the major languages in Mexico today. Next, please. Now, this study that they did with the farm workers in California identified that there are 23 different indigenous languages spoken and representing 13 different Mexican states. You know, the majority, like I said, coming from the southern part of Mexico, like Guerrero, Chiapas, Quintana Roo, Campeche, those areas, even Michoacan, we have a lot of from Michoacan, and the study was asking young people what is their language that they speak at their house, and most of them said, especially those who born in Mexico and come to the United States, they speak their native language with their parents and siblings at home. However, also the study noticed that as soon as they live longer and establish themselves here in the United States, only 2 out of the 5 will continue speaking the native language to the children, not everyone. Even though they continue speaking the native language with parents and siblings, they will not speak with children, with their own children in their native language. Next, please. Now, we understand also that most of the indigenous adults who coming from Mexico to live and work here in the United States are fluent in their native languages, and their Spanish is a basic Spanish. They can have basic conversation in Spanish, but not I have a whole, complicated or more structured conversation. They are basics in their Spanish. Then, and at the same time, because most of them, speak basic Spanish in their native language, when they are living here, they tend to speak in their native language and Spanish, or make a combination of both when they talk to the children. However, those children who are even born here in the United States or come here when they were little and they are growing here, they feel more comfortable speaking in English, not either in their native language or Spanish. Then that's it. Something that I will explain more about what these cause in the families, indigenous Mexican families. Next, please. We also identified that here in California, Mixtec, Zapotec, and Triqui are the predominant languages of indigenous adults. That doesn't mean there's, like I said, there's 23 different ones, but the most common ones are the Mixtec, Zapotec, and Triqui. Now, one of the these language barriers, may explain why some clinicians, social workers, and educators has difficulties communicating with parents who has children's, receiving any kind of services, and they prefer to speak English, because like I said, the barrier in the language is the children prefer English and the parents speak more the native language of Spanish. And if the educator, the social worker, the clinician doesn't know either Spanish or native language, they don't know if their children are really translated correctly or the way they want to give the message to the parents, and vice versa. They don't know if the message the children's are supposedly translated is the real message the parents are giving to the clinician, the social worker, and the educator. That's one of the conflicts that we see a lot here in California, and you most likely gonna see it in other states in the United States too. Next. Um, by 2010, and we can say 2015, the study identified that approximately there were 165,000 indigenous farm workers and families only in California. Then that's mean that concentration, especially in border, like we said, in border cities, will be higher of indigenous families, and most likely you're gonna start getting contact with some of them. Usually farm workers, especially, and like I said, I referring more to farm workers because that the study, even though we know and now the urban settings also there's a lot of indigenous people. We have in the Los Angeles cities a lot of Zapotecs, Mixtecs, Chinandecos, especially living in LA in urban settings and working in the maquiladoras. But they usually live in crowded places, small apartments where live multiple people. Not necessarily they are relatives, but they usually live because they speak the same language or they're coming from the same Mexican region. Then not necessarily they are siblings or parents and children's. However, because the common language, they will tend to live together, and that's I will explain how can create also some conflicts between the indigenous communities. Next, please. As this graphic, you can see, and the farm workers from Mexico are the greatest numbers, at least here in the United States. And that's why we're referring more to the farm workers and indigenous communities from the farm workers. Next, please. Okay, most of indigenous farm workers are males. There are few children. However, the children start to increase in numbers because a lot of the farm workers are starting to establish themselves, especially here in California. And also there are more women's coming. However, we still know there's more males, indigenous males, working as a farm workers. In a house, also, like I said, because it's a crowded, sometimes you're gonna see multiple households because if there's married couples, each of those married couples will consider themselves as a household, even though they're living in the same place. Or if they're siblings or living with their parents, even older children who are married still living with their parents in order for them to afford a decent living condition here in California. Also, part of my experience working with especially Zapotecs and Mixtecs here in Los Angeles, women's who, depending on the age, will not speak. If you visit a place and there's a woman is and you're visiting them, they're not going to speak with you alone. You're going to see there are a lot of adults that will be there, even if they don't speak anything or they don't say anything, they will be present in order for the woman to speak to any of you. And that's with visitors, and as soon as you start to develop a relationship, is going to change, but still you're going to have to talk with several people at the same time. Next. Also, it is common to find divided families or separated families between Mexico and the United States. You know, several indigenous men living in the United States have their wives and younger children in Mexico in their own towns. And if you go, for example, to several towns in Oaxaca, Chiapas, or Yucatan Peninsula, in the 3 different states there, you're going to find out that most of the people living in those towns are young children, elders, and women, because the males on the working age are either living and working in the United States or in another part of the world, but most commonly here in the United States. And like I said, you know, here in California, we have a lot of from Oaxaca, Guerrero, and they are the sustain of their families and their own towns too. Next. Also, one thing that we identify is that those who are staying at their own towns in Mexico, as soon those male children reach adolescence, they come to live and work in the United States with their parents, and females come later in their age, like 18 and older. They usually don't come when they are adolescents. They were to be older, but they will come to live and work in the United States too.
So I want to talk a little bit about the separation of families in the process. This separation can be very extremely painful, and their reunification after several years can be very, at the same time, joyful, but very stressful for families. Many of the men who come to the United States to work leave their wives, like Javier said, leave their wives in Mexico, but also that also means that they're moving back and forth. So that constant separation creates trauma in these families and their children, and they also, the separation, the relationship suffers a lot. And with that also brings diseases, because the males here will have relationships and they go back to Mexico and they will infect the women. There will be violence as well. So the separation in the process, the children will also suffer in education because of the depression or the feeling of not being together as a family.
And we will discuss more ahead about all of those issues. But what is important here is a lot of young people who come in from that separation and reunification has that kind of stressful relationship, because some of them, the parents leave, you know, when they were little children, and now they come in the adolescent time when it's, as you know, even though they are indigenous, they have the same situation as most adolescents, where they are trying to get their own identities, they're rebellious. Then they don't have that relationship growing with their parents, and that causes a lot of stress, a lot of problems inside the homes. And we will talk more about ahead. Uh, Next, please. Now, we need to understand, and this is not only here in California, but because we're based on the California study, we understand that indigenous farm workers has lower access to health services, and that includes mental health services, compared to other Mexican farm workers in California. We call them mestizo, you know, those who don't identify as an indigenous. They probably have more access to health services and mental health services than indigenous farm workers. And even those who were in the cities, they will have less access to. Indigenous women also go to the doctor less than Mexican mestizo women here in California. And I think that's something that you can start looking at in each of your states. And it's a common behavior from indigenous communities. Next. Also with the farm workers, especially with males, there's a really common behavior. If for any reason any male get ill or feel ill, they're gonna do a self-medication. They will ask a neighbor, a friend, or a relative for something they can drink or take to feel better. If they don't, improve, they're gonna seek care from a traditional healer, or if they can go, they will go back to Mexico to get the treatment before they use any assistance here in California. And only if they are really cannot do anything else, they're gonna go to emergency room when those critical situations. That's a common behavior in a lot of indigenous males here in California. Next, please. Now, why is this situation? Besides the cost of the service, we know that mental and medical services here in California are really expensive. A lot of those indigenous farm workers don't have health insurance. If they work in urban settings too, they don't, those work that they have with the maquiladoras, which are sweatshops, they don't provide health insurance too. They usually also face a lot of other challenges, like in the rural areas, lack of transportation is one of the main issues. Clinics or programs are really far away from the fields. They require transportation and they cannot go. Also, the clinic hours or program hours are convenience. As you know, we work with nonprofits and we have regular, working day time. That's the same time that most of them work. And if they don't have other choices for hours, most likely they will not have access to those services. Also, when they go to those services, clinics or programs, sometimes they have to wait for a long time, and that is another challenge that they face. Rude treatment by staff, and that's mean resection or other stuff. Um, Only a quick example, I was working with an organization a long time ago, and I was the only indigenous person there, and a family, Zapotec family, came to look for services, and they couldn't communicate with them because they were not fluent in Spanish. And then the receptionist called me and said, there's here a person who don't speak Spanish, but is from Mexico. I don't know why they don't speak Spanish. We have to do a training to make sure that people understand that not necessarily because they're coming from Mexico, they're gonna speak fluently Spanish or either English. Then it is important for us to remember that treating people well is important when we provide services to our communities. Also, they had a fee related to immigration status. If some of them are undocumented, they will, probably not feel comfortable going to the programs. Then we need to make sure that when they access our services, that we provide the right information and said that immigration status is not a problem for provide the services. The other biggest challenge is the linguistic and cultural barriers. If you don't have people speaking the languages or be cultural sensitive, it's really difficult that they will come and look for the services. The other, and in these, in the linguistic and cultural barriers, the problem is because there's not a lot translators in the programs. If a clinician, for example, is trying to communicate, they will look for the children's that they speak English, and they will try to use, or a friend who come with them as a translation. That create a conflict because they have a delicate matters to discuss. They will not be openly discussed because it's their children or their friends. They don't want them to know about. Then that limited the clinician, social workers communication with them. Next, please. Also, we know here in California, for example, one example is my program that I work with teen parents. We use telephone-based translations, and that doesn't really help a lot to indigenous people to feeling like they can communicate, because translation by phone is kind of, impersonal. It is a good way to communicate, but at the same time it's really difficult, and that can contribute to distrust. They will not like to come back or follow the treatment, because remember, depending also who's translating in through the phone and how that service is provided. Then even though that exists here in California and probably in other states, we recommend that you think about the telephone-based translation. Also, something that is particularly with indigenous women is that they are unwilling to discuss any sexually or reproductive issues with male providers, and that is in mental health and medical services.
Yes, and so it's so important to understand that women, there is not that they don't want to talk about their sexuality or their reproductive issues. It's also about the lack of information or awareness, and also who is talking to them. For example, at the East LA Women's Center had developed a Promotora program, which addresses issues of women, issues of domestic violence, sexual assault, and other parenting, other issues. But the point is that if you give a woman a space to talk, they'll be willing to talk. So that's why the Promotora programs are very important. And so if you don't have these kind of programs in your communities or in your programs, really it's a good place to go look for them, learn more about them, because any Promotora program can start at any population, especially indigenous women. There's so many communities, and because you go and look for women in their community who talk about their issues, understand their traumas, understand their challenges, and you train them to go and train other women and bring it into their programs, that is going to be very helpful to all the indigenous communities and women, especially if they want to talk about their children. Most women, when we have done Promotora programs and trainings, we ask them, why are you here? And the first question they have is, how do I talk to my children? Talk to them about sexuality, talk to them about drugs and alcohol, talk to them about, bullying or any other issue. So it's important to train the women well and have them access to different programs and services, and also do these trainings in their language. It's been done. We have done it with African communities. So it's very important to find out more about programs that really address the issues of the specific populations.
Next one, please. Now, also, you need to remember that a lot of indigenous women come from remote areas within Mexico. And in those remote areas, most likely they have poor medical services or not existent, and less mental health services. They also are unfamiliar with concepts and procedures, and we need to be mindful when we discuss with indigenous women about this concept. We tend, as a professionals, to use too much jargon. You hear about in the goals, the PTSD. PTSD for a professional mental health provider will be easy to understand, but not to those who are not in the field. For example, for me, we use MOB, FOB. That means father of the baby or mother of the baby. But when we say it in front of our clients, they don't know what we're talking about. Then be mindful that a lot of the concepts that you will use or questions that you have needs to be in a simple language that will be more understandable. And or if you're going to use a term, to have the time to explain the person what do you mean with that. If you're going to refer them to medication or treatment, what it is, and understand that really well, because remember, those are unfamiliar concepts and things that are completely foreign for them. Especially when you translate it, is more complicated. Then, for that reason, indigenous farm workers, women and men, will use alternative traditional healers. Some of those are like yerberos; those are herbalists, people who knows how to use herbs in different ways to treat illness. Sobadores, those are massage specialists. They manipulate your bones, your muscles. The huesero is also, it's especially like a chiropractor. The sobador use like those cupping that you see with the Chinese community, and the huesero will manipulate with their hands the body. And we also have within the alternative traditional healer the curandera, curandero, which we can translate as a spiritual healer, but it's more than just a spiritual healer. What we need to understand is when we talk about mental health issues, most of indigenous people will not go to a mental health provider because first they don't understand the concept of therapy, and at the same time all that jargon that we use is really foreign, but they can understand the plática or the conversation with a curandera or curandero. They will listen to their troubles. They will find out why they have all these situations, and it's going to be like a therapy session with the curandero or curandera. But they don't call it like that. They call it plática, a conversation, a friendly conversation. Then they will feel better having this conversation, receiving that way of therapeutic treatment, and at the same time, the curandero or curandera will provide them with different ways to treat their illness. And some of those curanderas and curanderas are yerberos too, hueseros or sobadores at the same time. Then they have in a whole session a holistic way of treatment, which is a challenge for a lot of our programs, and we need to consider that in the future. Next, please. Then in that sense, you're gonna probably hear from people talk in using different terms like mal de ojo, like susto, scenes like empacho, that usually they use to represent certain illnesses, and it is important for providers to these communities to have familiarity with those terms and don't see it as they don't know what they're talking about, because it's a common way to describe illnesses. And the curanderas, curanderos, and all traditional healers has right treatments. And you can see that when they go, they get treated and they get well. Then it is important for medical providers and mental health providers to be open to those type of uh, language or terms that they use. And of course, for those issues, mal de ojo, susto, empacho, anything, they're gonna go first to a healer, a traditional healer, than any Occidental provider. Next, please. Now, in the case of the mental health, and because I'm not a therapist, I cannot go deep into that, but it is important to understand that, like we discussed previously about, this separation between families, does create a lot of stress, and therefore women's and indigenous people experience a lot of, poor mental health and higher stress level. Why is that? More than others that you can consider Latinos, it because they come, they live in, like we said, in crowded spaces. That's create a lot of conflict sometimes between people living together, lack of privacy. If someone, like for example, right now we have the COVID-19, is if one person in that uh, living place, got infected, a lot of them will be infected too. Then that's create a lot of challenges within the living conditions. Depression is also higher in women and men and young people because of cultural and linguistic isolation. Like I said, the conflict between the children and parents is some children prefer to speak more in English, but if their parents are not fluent in English, they will try to speak with them in the limited Spanish in their native language. Then that creates a lot of conflict and can conduce to depression. We know there's a higher risk for suicide between indigenous people living in these conditions. Then it is important to be sensitive to those issues. PTSD and substance abuse is common because PTSD is not only about the separation here in the United States, but remember they're coming from communities and a nation that discriminate against indigenous people. They feel that if they speak the language, they dress in their traditional clothes, people are gonna see them as less. Then suffering that discrimination has forced them to come to the United States for look for opportunity for work. And here, when they come, people, when they know they're from Oaxaca, Guerrero, they also feel that pressure that why they don't speak Spanish, why they are not like the regular Mexicans, why they don't dress like a charro or, you know, like that kind of music. It's because they forgot that, millions of people are indigenous in Mexico, not necessarily mestizos. Then that create that trauma. Also, the other trauma is the travel from their state to the United States. Crossing the border has a lot of violence, um, and also a lot of economic stress for them. And when they come, usually they're gonna work where they don't have a higher education in Mexico. They will look for low skills jobs, and that's why we have a lot of concentration in the farm world because most of them know how to work on the land and doesn't require a higher education for that. Then that's part of the trauma. There's multiple traumas for young people, from women and men. That trauma, because it's constant, they come in here, they're separated from their families, they are, with people who speak their own language but they don't are friends or relatives. They feel so isolated that they start into experience that depression. Also, women's feel that because they are less in numbers, they don't have a space to talk to privacy too. They feel that pressure to keep up with their houses, with their work, and with their children. Some of them work on the field all day, and then they need to take care of the relatives and their children at home. Then it's a lot of pressure for them. And substance abuse,
Alcohol.
and drugs are so common, accessible, that the first thing is to numb all of these frustration, all of these feelings. They use alcohol and
And
substance.
even though they are in very crowded conditions, they feel very isolated. So it's so important to have spaces for people to really talk about their issues, mental health issues.
And those, as you know, does create also a high risk for neglect and also child abuse, domestic violence situations. HIV transmission, sexually transmitted diseases, and that's a big need in these communities.
And because of the stigma that, as Javier said, they already comes from their own places, their own country, their own states. They come to the United States and they come to a clinic where they're going to be not treated right. That's how they don't trust the systems, because they already are faced with so much stigma about who they are, the language they speak, or even how they look. That we have to trust this. Our communities are very resilient. We want to do best, we want to do better, we want the most for our children, but we are faced with so much discrimination and trauma that we need to address those issues first.
Okay, next one, please. Then when we work with indigenous people from Mexico, we have some recommendations for everyone based on our experience and what we see here in California. First, it is important to distinguish indigenous patients from other Mexican people and be sensitive about that. Because like I said, when you see and hear, oh, they're from this state or from this town that is in Mexico, we cannot assume automatically that because they're coming from Mexico, they are like the regular Mexican that you have ideas or stereotypes about. We need to be distinguished of what indigenous community they come. One example of this is, for example, someone could say, I'm a Zapotec, but there's 8 different languages within the Zapotec community. And I say languages because they are not, even though they have the same root, Zapotec, they are not dialects. They are complete languages. One Zapotec will not communicate with another Zapotec because their languages are completely different, even though they are Zapotecs. Then those are really important to understand. Recognize that there's indigenous people coming from Mexico, from different states, and we need to respect them about their own identity. We cannot also, they will not identify themselves as a Latinos or Hispanics. Mm-hmm. They will identify as indigenous persons, and we need to respect that too. Therefore, we need to provide indigenous cultural appropriate care. If we want to work with these communities, we need to provide that. We need to identify people, and part of that is to train and hire interpreters from their own communities. People who can understand the process of mental health, medical services, social services, education, where they can explain in their own languages to their own communities. And that's the way that problem the using friends or children's to translate will be reduced, and a more translator that it work as these will help in the communication. Also, it's important, like Thelma mentioned, and she can explain more about the promotora programs. Promotoras are a really way to utilize people from their own communities.
Yes, and so it's important to understand when we say cultural appropriate care, indigenous cultural appropriate care, because sometimes organizations or programs say we're very cultural just because they have one person that speaks Spanish or one person that they in the case that Javier was talking about, is like, here's somebody from this community, come and talk to them. Automatically assume that everybody talks the same language, that you are from the same country, and it's not realistic. And also that's the reason why we should look for programs that really understand that community and really focus on the needs of that community. For example, like I said before, we have promotora programs that deal with issues of HIV and STDs transmission, but also more important, we have programs of promotoras that deal with domestic violence, sexual assault, mental health. And in LA County, there is the promotora program that deals only with mental health issues. They are trained in that through the mental health department. And what they do is they really, again, they go into the community, they hire people from the community, they are the gatekeepers of those communities. And they are trained to understand the needs of those communities. But most of it, they learn how to trust them in the community, because we got to understand that the indigenous community are very close-knit communities. They come to the United States, they continue to be very close, and so you have to build the trust in the community. They cannot just trust you just because you have a white coat, or if you come from a big system. Definitely they're not going to trust, because they have been traumatized so much through different processes that they're not going to trust you easy. So to build trust, you have to build programs that really welcome them with their language, with their ideas, even with food, because it is important. We all like to have something that makes us feel at home and comfortable.
Mhm. You know, and that's why it is important to train staff in a cultural sensitive and understanding of the diversity of Mexico, especially. Remember, I mentioned before there are more than 360 indigenous languages. We have millions of people speaking indigenous languages, and that's their mother tongue. You know, and it's important to understand also in that diversity, not necessarily we communicate each other in the same way. Like Telma said, you know, I'm a Nahuatl person. My native language is Nahuatl, but my Nahuatl is not the same Nahuatl that people in Guerrero will speak. You know, they talk a Nahuatl. I don't want to be linguistic here, you know, but my Nahuatl is a T Nahuatl. Then it's a different in the language. It's the same with the Zapotecs, with the Mixtecs, with the Chol, with the Lacandones, you know, Tojolavales. There's so many languages that we need to be understanding that Mexico is a diverse and multilingual country. It's not just the mariachi that we see on the May 5th, you know, or the tequila. It's more than that. It's a richness in culture and traditions, and also the way we perceive the world is different. Looking for traditional healers is not because we are backward, but because it is so related to the way we perceive life and we perceive our relationship with others. Then using those relationship is important if you want to create programs that are sensitive and provide the right services to the indigenous communities coming from Mexico and living in your state, in your city. You know, then make sure that you look for approaches that will contribute to the integration of indigenous Mexicans to your services. Next, please.
Next.
Next. Now, also, like Thelma mentioned about the gatekeepers in the community, it's important for each of your programs to identify and collaborate with local communities organizations. In the picture, you see members of the FIOV, that's the Frente Indígena Oaxaqueño Binacional. It's a strong organization here in California. They work with, from farm workers to urban settings. Odilia, who's in the front, she's a social worker. It's a really a great leader. They had read a network of interpreters from different Zapotec languages, Mixtecos, Triquis, and different communities. And even they are helping not only the indigenous Mexican, but also the Mayas too. They have a good relationship with Quiches, Cachiqueles, Canjovales. Then it is important to look for those community organizations that work with indigenous communities because they know how they can provide better services. They can also help to develop a network of translators and work with each of your programs to provide cultural sensitive and inadequate services to indigenous communities. Also, traditional healers are important. As you know, most of the indigenous people will look for the traditional healers to treat their illnesses. Then it is important the organization has those communication with traditional healers. A lot of those traditional healers are what you can find them on what they call it botanicas, where they sell herbs, they sell candles, things like that. And botanicas are common here in California, and that's where you can find different traditional healers. Also, it is important to consider if your program can have a more holistic approach. Telma's organization do some of that, use traditional ways of healing, circles where you discuss and you use smudging and all of that. That is common for a lot of indigenous people to feel comfortable and provide those services. Then contact with traditional healers will help to provide that more holistic way in mental health and medical services. Also, it is you can contact churches. As you remember, I mentioned the majority of people coming from Mexico, even indigenous, they consider themselves Catholics. And then if you want to find it where they are, go to the churches. And for example, we know, like, if we want to find, indigenous from Central America here in California, we go to Los Angeles, the St. Thomas Church. There's where going to be all the Mayas there. And if we want to find indigenous Mexicans, we go to the Placito Alvera in the downtown Los Angeles or the Cathedral, because there's they're going to be concentrated. Then identify those churches where people will be going, and also identify hometown networks. A lot of people who come in, especially from Oaxaca. In Oaxaca, from the almost 3/4 of the municipalities in Oaxaca are autonomous. They don't have the political government from Mexico. They don't have jurisdiction. It's their own traditional way to do that. They have their own authorities. They use their own laws. They use their own ways. Then people who come in here, they work in their hometown networks because they need to, for example, repair the church. They do an event here in California. They collect money and they send it to the town. If they need to build a park for the town, they do the same. Those hometown networks are important to have relationship. Identify and have a relationship, because if you get the trust of them, then you're gonna get the trust of the community members too. And develop that relationship, because indigenous community will come to you if their organizations trust you, and if those who they consider it more familiar with, they are okay with you, then they're going to be okay receiving the services. Also, remember to create cultural and appropriate office spaces. What this means is, if you're working with Zapotecs, Mixtecs, find out the ways that they will feel better, dedication space to things that they are more familiar with, weavings, since symbols that represent their own communities, where they can feel really welcome, and have people, to be sensitive in the sense of, if you're not from that community, don't wear the traditional clothes, because it could be considered like an offensive for someone in the indigenous community, unless you are, have a relationship with them and they give it to you as a gift, that traditional dress or shirt, and if they're fine with you, you can use it, and that's part of what we learn in the process of working with indigenous communities.
Yes, it's also very important, for example, in our organization, we are very aware that we need to um, honor some traditions that people normally do. In for example, El Día de los Muertos, we put an altar for the Day of the Dead, and people are welcome to put their pictures or they put their different things that they believe in, and it's open to anyone. To anyone that wants to do it or don't want to do it. We also did a healing garden in the back of our office, and the women are welcome to come in the back and see the flowers, see the plants, and contribute to those plants. And we had a day to collect even the dirt. You know, when people work with dirt to put plants, to make tortillas. You know, an event that we did also at the office, we bought a comal, and women were making tortillas. Women who had never done that also were very welcome and understand that this is a tradition. This part of it makes people feel home in a community. And we do acknowledge those kind of cultural things that people feel connected to. And they're also, that's part of building trust with that community, building that idea that, you know, they gotta teach me, but I also can teach them about who I am. Just being welcome and respectful of their language, and definitely not talk about not using their language in any space, because that also is going to be a reason why they will not go into your services.
Okay, next one.
No, that's it. So now we're in the part of the questions. We moved a little fast because we wanted to have some more space. Last time we had a similar presentation. We had so many questions that we couldn't, we didn't have enough time to answer. And that's the reason we left a little more time. So hopefully we can answer more questions this time.
Thank you, Javier. We do have a couple of questions, so I'm glad we're going to be able to sort of go through them. Okay, so let me start with the first one. What about the indigenous evangelical followers? Do you have statistics on them? And I guess this was when you started addressing at the beginning their the religions and all that.
Yes, and at least the experience in California, yeah, we have some Protestant, the different kinds of Protestant indigenous people. But like I said, the majority, at least the experience I had, is they are considered themselves Catholic. However, there are some Pentecostal. I had clients who were Pentecostal, but they are still open. They understand the needs they have, and they have access to services that are open to those services. Now the difference will be more of what is the connection. You know, if you know which church they belong, it's important to have you know, conversation with the pastors on those churches that will help you to get a better communication. But in general, my experience has been that they are open like any other indigenous person to services when they develop that trust with you.
Thank you. Okay, let me go through a couple of these. Okay, the next one says, is there a difference between women who grew up here versus women that come when they are older?
Yes, there's a big difference. Like I mentioned in the presentation, those who come when they are little or they born here, they will prefer to speak in English and have a whole communication in English and not in the native language or Spanish. They will also have a different in the way of how they feel they are addressed to, in my experience, those who born here are strongly feeling about their identity. For example, if they are Zapotecs, they're gonna tell you they're Zapotec. They're not Latinos, Hispanic, not even Mexican. They're gonna tell you I'm Zapotec, even they born here in the United States. And you're gonna have also those who to grow up here from they were little. They will not speak even in Spanish. They will feel offense if you speak them in Spanish because of how they look. Then that's one of the biggest difference. Now, those who are older, they will tend, if they don't know you, they will tend to speak in their native language. Even though they speak Spanish, they will never speak Spanish with you first until they trust you. Then you're gonna start seeing how much Spanish they know, and you can communicate. I had a client many years ago. She was Zapotec, married with a Chinandeco, and her husband was older in that sense, and he was more fluent in Spanish. The first meetings I had to do it with her husband present, and also friends where they live. Then later, when they started to develop trust, she started talking in Zapotec and started speaking in Spanish, and she was fluent in Spanish, and she was one of the Pentecostal clients that I had too, by the way, for the question they asked about evangelicals. And she was open to the services, but building trust take time. And even I'm, as an indigenous person, I'm different than the Zapotec, I'm now, then they know we're different. And creating trust is a process, is a take times and take different ways to do that.
Thank you. That is really interesting. Okay, I'm going through. Oh, somebody asked about the Promotoras program, but they were specifically asking if, by any chance, if there's a program in Salinas, Santa Cruz area.
So is that California, right?
I guess, yeah.
Yeah, AMC. I don't know, but there's the statewide promotora organization that can give you information, and it's called the statewide promotora program. And they most likely will have the list of all the promotora programs. I personally don't have that information.
Yeah, they can find also community radios. I know in Salinas, Fresno, and Bakersfield, there are Mexican indigenous community radios. Zapotec and Mixtec most commonly they have whole programming in Zapotec and Mixtec, and they starting, at least in Fresno, they're starting to have programming tricky too.
Awesome. Okay, so this one says, through your experience, how they feel about the treatment that Latinos provided them here in the United States. I guess that means like when they have Latinos providers.
It's interesting, that question, because it's not easy to answer, because some people, providers who consider themselves Latinos, have a different mind than those who have some recognition of their indigenous roots. Then I think it depends on the sensitivity that each provider has. It doesn't matter if it's Latino, African American, or Anglo. The most important thing is how sensitive you could be to the needs and the way you are going to communicate with them. Learning about their ways of doing. Like I said, for example, in my experience, Zapotec and Mixtec, if you talk to someone, you're gonna be in a room full of people. You're not gonna be alone. they're gonna be there. They don't wanna say anything, but they're gonna be there present until they build the trust with you. Then you're gonna start seeing less and less people in the room. You know, at the point that when the trust is built, you can have that conversation most likely one-on-one, but it's gonna take some time. Then it is important that anybody take that in consideration to be more sensitive, to make sure that those concepts of confidentiality we have has to be built with time, you know, because there are issues that we cannot discuss in openly with full of people audience, but you know, when the time comes, then you can go and ask more confidential issues with your client or patient. It's important to have that in mind because trust is not built in one session. You know, you will require more time to do that.
And I think when you're doing cultural trainings, that everybody is trained, not just because you're a Latina. Well, she knows already. No, because the Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, everything that we are called, everybody sees ourselves different in all those spaces. So we need to have cultural sensitive trainings across the board, from the front person who receives you, like the front desk, to the executive or directors to understand how to serve indigenous communities. A training across the board.
Thank you both. I do agree with what you just said about training across the board, that it's really important for these communities. Okay, in terms of, I guess this has a little bit to do with trust you were talking about just now. The question is, how do they feel about their kids going to school? And does the children share to them how they are treated? And I guess this goes like how they've been treated in school. And I don't know if it's talking about specifically like bullying or stuff like that, but like, I guess, how does that work in terms of the whole family unit?
You know, it's a complex question because it's important to understand that a lot of indigenous people, like we explained, come with that trauma of discrimination in their own country, especially in Mexico. You know, in Mexico they use a word, and I know it's common in many countries, but most likely they said to improve the race is to become lighter in skin color. Then a lot of indigenous communities are more darker in their appearance, and from that point, there have been discriminated in the countries. If they speak their own language, also they are more discriminated, and they are considered ignorant. You know, in Mexico. Then when they come here to the United States, they're coming from a condition that is discrimination, a lot of challenge. They don't have services. They don't have even schools for themselves. The education in Mexico, they call it bilingual education, is not to respect their language and their culture, is to assimilate them into the national identity, to homogenize them, to become Mexicans, not continue being indigenous. Then when they come here and the school system require for them to send their children to the school, they have some resistance, but they know they have to follow the law, and they send their children, but they face that situation. You know, children starting to grow into those schools, learning different histories, learning different things. And as you know, and I don't want to offend anybody, but as you know, our history here in the United States, it's from the point of view of not us as indigenous people, even indigenous people from the United States. Then indigenous are not mentioned at all, and a lot of schools are not sensitive to that. Now we're starting to see some changes, especially in Los Angeles, where community organizations like the FIO that I mentioned, the Frente Indígena Nacional, is providing seminars, trainings to teachers of the school district, to the police forces, the LAPD, because it is important to understand that diversity and also what the main needs of the communities are. Then most of the children are going to grow learning English. They will even go to university. We have a lot of indigenous Mexicans who has PhDs, MSWs, different master degrees. Now, because of that opportunity, and that entered in a lot of conflict, because when you have people educated versus those not educated, we need to be more sensitive in that sense. Our diplomas doesn't change who we are. At least that's my personal point of view. I could have master degrees, but I'm continuing to be a native person, and I would be a native all the rest of my life, because that's how I born. And but that doesn't mean that with the children is going to create some conflict within our children's. You can see that Telma is Maya, and our children were growing with the school system here, and now older, some of them are more towards I want to learn more about our traditions, I want to follow some traditions, and some others are yeah, I know, but I'm fine how I am. Then we need to be respectful also with children's growing in that sense, how they want to feel comfortable with their cultural heritage too. And that will create a lot of stress. Then if you are a mental health provider, make sure that you open that space to see between you're talking with parents how their communication is with their children growing here in the United States.
Thank you so much. And with that in mind, the next one says, has the culture been lost with the younger generation? Like, how would you see the differences in that sense?
Well, I can, these are good questions, and we can talk for hours about that. But trying to explain this, it's really hard to talk about cultural loss in that sense, because I prefer to use a term other than acculturation, transculturation, because when you coming from an indigenous community, you bring something to this culture and you adopt other things from this culture. Like I learn English, I speak Spanish in my native language. Then in that process, we understand, what the United States is, and we become part of this society. Then, but at the same time, we can still keep some of those traditions. Of course, a lot of the things are, the culture is linked also to the land. Then in urban settings, a lot of that is lost, but can be, readjust. Like for example, what Telma was sharing, there's a lot of people that now here in California more common to see the Day of the Dead celebration, sorry, than many years ago. Like 20 years ago, I didn't see that kind of celebration more commonly like now you can see. Then people feel comfortable to bring things that represent their culture and where they coming from, the roots, to those kind of celebrations that are Christian celebration, but I recognize that are, a combination between Christianity and indigenous values. Then those are special things. The language suffer a lot. A lot of young people who grew up here or born here tend to prefer, like I said, to speak English. They don't speak the language. They don't speak either Spanish, and they don't feel comfortable with those languages. Only with English.
I think the loss also can be reversed if we all put a little bit of effort into bring it back into our own houses and our own communities, because it's there. We were just having a conversation yesterday, and I remember like what my grandma used to tell my mom to use for my bellyache, and then I did it for my children, and then my daughter that has a child now, she calls and she says, "Mom, my son has this bellyache. I remember you gave me something. What was that?" And it was a root. And so there is so much culture that we still have, and we don't recognize it as a culture or indigenous ways, and it is, and we have to give it credit, because I think that we haven't lost all of it, and I think it's time to rescue a lot of that or revive it, because it's still there. It has never gone away. It's still there and very alive.
Yeah, and I know that you're probably familiar with the term decolonizing. I don't want to go deep into that, but that's used a lot here in the United States. And what we see it in that way is it's opportunities. Now, people like Thelma said, our daughter, for example, when she got married, she asked, "Can I have a traditional marriage with the Occidental one?" And we did a combination ceremony. We had the person who signed the act of marriage, and we had our own traditional marriage too, based on our traditions. And those are opportunities, because young people starting to see that, recognizing themselves, then we need to start providing those spaces. And any program in the community that can provide those safe spaces is important too, because remember, in some communities, people sometimes are not open to other cultures. Then your programs are spaces where you can create those safe spaces where, like Latama said, when women can speak, when women can talk openly without fear of anything, when young people can come and talk about their culture and talk about their roots.
Yeah, we have talking circles with young people as well. So you just have to give it a safe space for people to really feel at home and feel connected.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. So I'm gonna translate this one. They wrote it in Spanish. So just so that everybody understands, I'm gonna translate it the best as I can. So they're asking, how would you explain to the indigenous communities why are minorities and Latinx the group with most COVID infections in California?
Well, right now, we know that here, at least in California, the incidence of cases of COVID-19 is higher in indigenous communities, in those who are, labeled as Latinos and African Americans, more than other communities. In Los Angeles County, for example, Latinos that include indigenous are the higher numbers. And it's because, remember, a lot of indigenous people work on those essential work spaces. They work in the warehouses, they work in the supermarket. Then they have been not stay at home. They have been working to survive, and exposure is higher for them. Also, it is important to understand that, if, like I said, if they live in crowded spaces, like happened a couple of weeks ago in Oxnard, California, there were farm workers when one got infected and infect almost 100 people in where they were living together. Then those are the risks that it has. It's important to understand that, because survival is include day work. Missing one day will create a lot of trouble for them. Then they trying to keep going, working on the farms, working in urban areas, and provide all these services, and because of that, the increase in the numbers is higher in those communities.
And the fear of going to services to get services. I know there's also the part that immigrants couldn't get certain support. You know, they will not be the ones getting the money to help them pay the rent. So they have to go out and work. They have to find money to feed their families. The fear of immigration, the fear of police. So there's a lot of reasons why people don't go to the resources, and the lack of, again, all the things that we have said, the fear, the lack of language, and the lack of resources specifically for those communities. Remember the trust. They're not going to trust somebody who's going to tell them, give me all your information so I see if you qualify. So there's a lot of reasons why the numbers are going higher, and part of it is lack of education. People are not reaching out directly to these communities.
And some few organizations, like the few, like I mentioned, ORO, or la Organización Regional Oaxaqueña, have been trying to develop some, announcement on languages, Zapotec, Mixtec, but most of the media is in English and Spanish. And a lot of indigenous people would not understand those messages. Well, I think I don't know if we are still on time, but I don't know if there's more questions.
Yeah, I'm just gonna do one more. And it goes like this. There was a mention at the end of not using their language in any space. Can that notion be expanded a little bit?
No, what Thelma referred to that is that don't restrict the use of the language when they come to your office space. Because there has been situations, and I experienced that, when they are speaking in their native language, other people who don't understand feel uncomfortable, and they say why they are speaking in that, what they say in that, and I think that's common also with people who only speak English and they don't even speak Spanish. If someone speaking Spanish is the same, then that situation is more increased in the sense of an indigenous person, when we're speaking in a language and someone is offended, go back to that trauma that we have from our with our own regions, where we cannot even speak a language publicly. Then it's important to be sensitive to that sense, like either in your program you allow people to speak in their own languages, whatever language is, and don't feel offended for that, because if they feel comfortable speaking in the language, they want to have a safe space where they can do that. And our programs should have those spaces for them. That's what we're referring to.
Thank you for expanding on that. That was our last question. And before we go, as always, we want to thank Thelma and Javier for such a wonderful presentation. The feedback through the question box has been incredible. So I just wanted to let you guys know that before we go. And I also wanted to remind everybody in the audience that we have another upcoming training related to this series, once again with Thelma and Javier, and that's going to be on July 24th. It's called Acculturation and Migration Trauma Among Latino Children, Youth, and Families from the Northern Triangle. You can go ahead to our website and you should find that on our calendar. If you haven't registered yet, on the chat box, I've been putting information on today's handout, our website, and on a couple of things. So you can find a link there to register for that training as well. So I don't know if Thelma and Javier want to say something before we go.
Yes, I just want to say thank you to everybody who participated. I think that we all can contribute to the change and raise all indigenous and all women.
Yeah, thank you for participating in this webinar. I know for the time we cannot cover everything, but we try to, start this conversation that you can continue with your own programs and in your own regions. Thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you both. It was great as always, and I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.